Okay, it's 10:06, so we will start. Welcome everybody to the Wuiwatch webinars program, and thanks to attend this third webinar on prevention planning in the wild-urban interface, a trans-scalar approach. The Wuiwatch project is an European observatory of prevention and defense against forest fires that affect urban areas and communities, the so-called wild-urban interface areas in Europe is assembling a permanent forum and a special interest group. You can find more information about this project on the Wuiwatch webpage, wuiwatch.org. Today's speaker is David Caballero. David Caballero has been studying since 1999 the wild-urban interface problem across Europe. David Caballero is also the project coordinator of Wuiwatch project. Just for your information, this webinar will have a duration of 1 hour, more or less. During the webinar, you will be able to make questions to the speaker, David Caballero, writing in the chat box that you can find below on the screen. So we will start with the webinar. Hi, David. Can you hear me? Good morning.
Hello, Jordi. Good morning.
Good morning. So it's your turn, David. All yours.
Thank you very much, Jordi. It's been a long time studying the wildland-urban interface in Europe. On the last 2 years, the interaction with the Pau Costa Foundation has been absolutely great within the framework of Wuiwatch project. We have learned a lot of each other, especially what I would like to point out today. It's a result of interacting with firefighters and which are their concerns when they perform their activities, their operations in the forest fires, particularly how difficult it is to approach the defense of the wildland-urban interface in the consolidated fire. So today we are going to see very briefly for about 1 hour or so about the approach that we are following. It's MeteoGrid, the private firm dealing with the prevention planning basically on forest fires, more particularly on wildland-urban interface. So this approach includes this, what we call the trans-scalar approach. That means that we look at the landscape, the wildland-urban interface at different scales. That's what we're going to see today. And besides to that, may I say that the problem is that when we talk about wildland-urban interface, normally in our chats between colleagues, are we talking about the same thing? Well, I see more frequently that not. It's not true. We are talking about consolidated fire from the approach at the town or the settlement in the big fire, or we are talking of fire running upslope, hitting a set of houses, or even we are talking about in this isolated houses which is receiving a fire. So all of it are wildland-urban interface. But it's rather confusing when we are talking about wildland-urban interface, that we are talking about the landscape, we are talking about settlements, and we are talking about isolated houses. Well, at the same time, it's exactly the same problem. So my suggestion is to look very carefully into this reality. Actually, we have the forest fire, consolidated forest fires running across the landscape and hitting towns, settlements, on industrial areas, and so. And this is what the firefighters has first to deal with. A consolidated fire, they have to set some strategies and some tactics to make this the fire under control and find the opportunities. But also we're talking about this. We are talking about different type of buildings, particularly this, which is a hotel in the middle of the forest with some scattered houses here and there. And we are talking, of course, about this type of settlements, which are not exactly the pure wildland-urban interface. This is an intermix. totally mixed with the forest. And we have as well, as I told you before, isolated houses totally embedded into the forest, as this case that we see in Valencia. So when we are talking about wildland-urban interface, the first thing, if we want to make this conversation in a coherent way, we should look at different scales and talk at different scales. But besides to that, may I think about our colleagues from the United States, Australia, and other countries around the world which are suffering these wildland-urban interface fires, that we in Europe, in the Mediterranean countries particularly, things are quite different than what we have in other countries like United States, Australia, South Africa, Canada, and so. First thing, and that I think that is relevant, that our houses essentially do not sustain ignition, do not burn, do not propagate the fire, because they are mostly made out of brick, stone, brick and mortar, and other unburnable materials. The other significant fact is that several settlements patterns, we have several types of patterns for wildland-urban interface. They are isolated houses that you can find around across the world. We have scattered houses here and there. We have intermix as well, and we have towns, cities, and compact settlements, which gives this direct contact from the urban area and the forest area. But we as well, we have a poor sense of community. Despite of other communities that we have seen, we have visited in the United States particularly, here in the Mediterranean area, we have a large set of individualities. That means that we have many people living together in a wildland-urban interface, but they do not interact between them. They take care of their own reality. Another point is that garden usually is encircled, surrounded by green edges, which is not very common in the United States and other countries. We have most of the houses are surrounded by these walls of green edges, which besides it, they are basically flammable species, and they burn like hell in case of a fire. As well, may I point out that we have very heterogeneous garden design. From nothing, I mean the house is amid of the forest and no garden at all, and up to the most beautiful, well-designed garden with a different species composition, design of the position of the plants, and different degrees of maintenance, of course, different degrees of irrigation. So what we can find in the wildland-urban interface in Mediterranean is extremely complex, heterogeneous realities, and we have to adapt to those realities. It's a fact that the wildland-urban interface in the Mediterranean countries are set in high fuel load lands. Basically, we abandon in the countryside much of the agriculture activity and the forest activity that leads into more continuity, more fuel load, so more likely to have large fires which affect large numbers of settlements, houses, towns. So what that means is that in the end, we will rely mostly on the self-protection. We can't wait for firefighters to protect all of the houses, all of the towns, because there are large fires affecting hundreds of houses at the same time. So which is why, for us, it is so important, the management of the land and the self-protection. So we are looking at two different scales here. We are talking about the landscape strategies in one side, large scale. We are looking into the individual house protection and settlement protection in the other hand. Besides to that, I think that it's relevant to point out that in Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean, we do not have large continuous patches of forests as we have in Canada and the United States. It's more likely to find these lands mixed with agriculture lands, what we call the agriculture forest mosaics. With all these, let's have a look of what I'm talking about. This is a typical town in Spain, and we have these forested areas in the surroundings. But look at the agriculture areas, which are mixed with all these forests, which tradition that give a degree of protection against fires, because these cultivated, maintained agricultural lands actually acted as fire breaks in most of the cases. You have a typical fire running on the grass of the agriculture and heating the forest and projecting new by fire branch to other agricultural lands, and this type of fire jumping from forest to forest through the agricultural lands is very frequent, as we saw in Greece in 2007, for example. And this is a two-side fact that the agricultural lands can drive the fire from one forest to the other, or act as fire breaks. And that's very important to understand that the land design at the landscape level gives us an opportunity for controlling controlling the fires when they are progressing, and especially those large fires, and protecting isolated, scattered, or towns houses. The fact is that the abandonment of this land, agricultural land activity, the problem is that is providing more continuity. So the fire finds fuel across its path, and the fact that the houses were by the side of the agricultural lands brings the fire very close to the houses. We'll see that the contact of the fire, the flame into the houses, is the main cause of house destruction in Europe, opposite to what happens in other countries like the United States, which is actually the flying fire brands. So why to approach the wildland-urban interface prevention at these different scales? Why? First of all, we're sure that we have a better understanding of wildland-urban interface and processes involved, understand the wildland-urban interface as a whole, and to speak in common terms, specifically what we are talking about, landscapes, settlements, or houses. But besides, we have seen in these last years that it is helping us to do a better planning, more, let's say, structured planning or prevention activities, and particularly what has to do with the time scale. We cannot pretend to have the whole landscape transformed in a few years or in a few months. It takes a different path, a different time frame as what we do in our garden. So we have different time frames. So we have to adapt the planning to those. Besides, what we have is that we have a better assignment of prevention responsibilities, because we are identifying which is responsible for transforming each of the scales in the landscape and try to make them to work together. Besides, what we have seen as well is that we have a better approach for the planning of defense operations, whether they are defense of houses, self-protection, or finding new opportunities for the fire control. As well, we are creating fire-adapted communities by creating relationships. Basically, that's a personal relationship, social relationships between the different responsibles on each level. That makes sense. That makes sense. If an administration, a government of country is providing a strategy at landscape level, that makes sense to couple that strategy to the local level with the municipality, and that makes sense to create a relationship with the owner at the micro level. I mean, we are talking about to have a consistent, coherent approach to the planning by considering who is responsible of each of the levels and which will be the activities to be performed. That makes sense. So this is the way we are approaching. We consider 3 different scales that we're talking about. First is what we call the macro scale. Macro scale is equivalent to the landscape. I mean, we're talking about large piece of land, which we will plan. We will have to plan strategically, taking into consideration vegetation, land uses, social and economical aspects, and plan, of course, in the long term. We take into account as well some environmental issues and some infrastructure issues as well. Then we have something that we call the meso-scale, which is the scale at the size of the settlement and its surroundings. This is the scale in which we have more opportunities to evolve the wildland-urban interface protection, because I will show you that it's basically non-existent. This treatment of this transformation, this meso-scale. So transformation should take basically in the mid to short terms. And finally, the microscale. We're talking about the house and the surroundings, the garden, the lot, and on the, let's say, some meters around the houses plus the houses. We see that the transformation at the microscale can happen in a very short time and can be tremendously effective in the prevention of the whole settlement, as I will try to demonstrate in a few minutes. Here you have some images to illustrate what I'm talking about. The macro scale, we are talking about a strategy. We do not take very short-term decisions, but it's long-term decisions, how to transform the landscape to provide some opportunities to the firefighters in case of the fire is approaching, consolidating towards settlement, to have some opportunities to firefighting control. This is normally what is done today, and it is clearly planned at the county of the province level and for the long term. If we go down to the settlement scale, we're talking about the meso-scale. The meso-scale is typically involving the settlement community and the municipality. We are talking about transformation of the surroundings and the inside of the settlement as well, and involving the municipality, the local authorities, and the homeowners. And finally, we have the microscale, which has been largely identified and studied as the home ignition zone on the defensible space, and so, which is basically the relationship between the house, the garden, and in case of the houses which are in the border of settlement, the relationship between the houses and the forested area. We are talking about the transformation at the few meters around the house and in the short term. With this in mind, let's have a look at a real case which for us it's very dramatic in the sense that it's representing a reality in many places in the Mediterranean countries, more particularly in the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in Spain. We're talking about one settlement which is Collserola. Collserola actually is an area very near Barcelona, which holds a number of settlements. Here you have a view of it. Where, at your right, you have the Mediterranean Sea, then you have all the urban area of Barcelona and all the surrounding towns, which are many municipalities. And in the middle of the screen, you can see a green spot. This green spot, a large forested area, fantastic place, very nice place to visit, is what we call the Park of Collserola. The point on this thing, within this Park of Collserola, as you see, it is secluded by a huge amount of urban areas, but as well, some of these urban areas are climbing up the mountains and mixing with the forested areas in the border. And we have, even though we have some settlements inside the forest, totally mixed with the forested areas. This is the view of the macro scale, and the firefighters have already identified some scenarios for fires in future, which could result in the total disaster. So they are thinking about some strategies about how to control the fire approaching these forested areas and find the critical point, the access points, the waters, and so. Where we are looking at the larger scale, and we see that these need a very complex approach and include many of the authorities, even the autonomy authorities, many entities like the Collserola Park and so. So we are talking about a big strategy involving thousands of people and other considerations. If we look into the meso-scale, we see that some of the settlements are in contact with forested areas or even are mixed with forested areas. We try to find some opportunities for firefighting of a fire approaching the settlement. We find that we have very few fuel control, limited accessibility, ground accessibility, and limited amount of accessible water. That means that this meso-scale in which we have to draw up our strategy, more particularly the tactics of defense of the settlement, it's entailing a problem. This sector is a problem. It is not an opportunity, but a problem. And typically is drawing resources from other parts of the fire and distorting the whole strategy of the fire control at the macro scale. So this is not prepared to hold a fire hit there today. What I mean is that the meso-scale is actually non-existent. In the micro scale, we look at many realities. We have a huge different numbers of houses, old houses, very well-built houses, mid-class houses, even those that I highlight here, which are very poor houses, or even some, let's say, something that they call houses, but they are huts. Actually, they are huts. So we have a different reality at the micro scales. In case of a fire, look, in case of a fire, we have an approaching fire that has the opportunity to move within the settlement. We have the fire embers falling everywhere and finding some fuel to start as a spot fire. And we have these draws, these box canyons drawing the smoke towards the houses. So we have very complex situation. So the individual reality of each houses is affecting the overall strategy and tactics in case of a fire. That means that every owner of every type of houses should take care of their own surroundings, and it will entail a big transformation in the meso-scale, as we will see later. Some cases about what we are talking about, some cases are very relevant, very significant. But what we have learned from firefighters, they talk about the fire reading space. It's what I've been talking just in the slides before. It's what we call about the granularity. What that means is which are the relevant dimensions, the relevant vegetation patches, the relevant strategies and phenomena which are relevant to each of the scales. At landscape level, we look for critical points, large patches of forest fuels, opportunities, fire breaks, natural fire breaks, accessibility, water points, and so on, that can give me opportunities in the strategic point of view of the controlling the fire. But at slope level, let's say there's a little slope, just local slope, we take care of local winds, local field transitions, particularly the jump from the surface field to the crown fuels. Crown fire runs, specifically they are very intense, short in space, I mean 200, 300 meters, but very intense, blow-ups, special local phenomena, and so. While the landscape level fire reading can be modeled by models, fire split models, forest field models, and so, and general wind models. At the slope level, at the mid-level, it is rather difficult to have all the information about the fuels, transitions, the fuel moistures, and more particularly the local winds and the interactions between the fire and the winds. And we have in the wildland-urban interface, we have something more important, which is the transition between the forest and the settlement, between the forest and the urban area. Because in that transition, we find different fuel species and different fire behavior, as we will see afterwards. Finally, what happens at local level, it's so difficult to model that we should need very complex physical models to really have a focus of what can happen in the surroundings of a fire. We are talking about particular fuels, non-forest fuels, but gardens and other plastics and other materials that can burn, on other events that can lead into the affecting the restriction of the house or creating new, let's say, clouds of smoke, and so. We are talking about a very, very detailed level if we try to model, forecast, predict, or operate in this local level. So as you see, we have at least 3 reading space, 3 granularities, and we need 3 total different degree of detail to gather data. On top of that data, apply some models and indicators, and on top of that, models indicators take some decisions. While the first one are the normal ones, they are the strategic one. The second, slope and local level, they are more tactical one. We are reactive more than proactive, like in this landscape level. And that's true. So we have to be coherent with these 3 fire reading spaces. We have to create these prevention infrastructures, these treatment fuels, according and be coherent with this fire relevant dimension. What that means is that if we plan and create a fire break, but we are thinking in the big fire, we are doing almost nothing. It's what we learned in the latest events in Canada, in Fort McMurray. We saw enormous fires consolidated, enormous fire fronts approaching settlement. And if we compare the size of the relevant dimension, which is not the flame length, it's the convection column. If we compare this convection column with the firebreak dimension, which is just said 30 meters or something like that, it's irrelevant. It is irrelevant. I mean, we have a fire level of several meters flame length, let's say 10, 15, 20 meters flame length. We can consider as an effective prevention infrastructure fire breaks of 30, 40, 50 meters. But when we have this convection column of consolidated fire of 80, 100 meters flame length, that fire break is irrelevant, even though it could be a rat trap, as we will see. This is what we are talking about. Big fire approaching our settlement. When we saw that settlement, they were prepared. They were a fire-adapted community, but not for this big fire. We've seen in detail that we have some communities which are surrounded by forest, but if we look in more detail, we see that they have a fire break surrounding the settlement. But when we compare this dimension with 30 meters actually with the size of the convection column, this is irrelevant. That means that we need much more transformation of maybe 200, 300, 400, 500 meters transformation of surrounding and maintenance of the forest to provide an opportunity of defending or even staying in this settlement. As today, this is not done. And what happens is the fire, even with this break, will pass through the settlement, wipe up all the houses and create a disaster. That was inspiring us to prepare the scenario in advance of the 3 scales. At least in Europe, we have an opportunity. And the big opportunity that we have, as I said before, is that our houses do not burn, they do not sustain burning as the wooden-made houses. That means that they do not spread the fire and they do not produce firebrands entailing the set of the fire in other surrounding houses. So what we are going to do is try to prepare this firefighting scenario in advance at the 3 scales. That is a matter of transformation, transform each of the scales. That means to transform the vegetation and other fuels, basically looking into the load and continuity to transform improved accessibility, specifically ground accessibility, because we're talking about tactics mostly in the mid and micro scale. So we need ground accessibility granted, water availability, house resistance, and finally, most important, people's behavior and best practices before, within, and after the fire. As you see, this multifaceted transformation, which leads in more safe, more efficient operations for the defense of the settlement in case of a fire, including those operations of evacuation or shelter in place, which in our countries is possible because, as I said, our houses do not burn in a sustained way. It's our objective to apply those transformations in each of the three scales. Let's have a look more in detail what that means in terms of macro scale. Actually is what we do. In the micro scale is what we do. We prepare the landscape for a large fire and take into account all these facts. We want to create landscape design to provide firefighting opportunities. That means that we will control the fire by controlling basically the fuel. That means to create discontinuities, to lower the fuel load. And in our case, as I said, because we have a forest agriculture mosaic, to provide more importance to agricultural lands, which are natural, traditional discontinuities in the forest fuel. Then to look into the transitions, avoiding fire consolidations, particularly the jump to crown fires. We call transitions when we have a dramatic, clear, sharp change of forest fuel that entails with other considerations a dramatic change in fire behavior from grasses to shrubs, from shrubs to crowns. We will look in the critical management points, those points in which if the fire reaches, the fire will increase the size dramatically and spread to a big basin on creating more difficulties in controlling the fire. So the management of fuels, transformation of fuels in the critical management points, as said before by other speaker, Mark Castello, was telling us very clear about the importance of these critical management points. We must think as well not only in transforming the landscape, the forest fuels, but transforming forest fuels means to transform the vegetation, the land coverage. That means that there's a direct, important, unavoidable relationship with societal and administrative transformation as well. So we need a commitment of the government, regional government, even local administrations, and provide strategies in the long term for that important transformation. Again, may I underline the importance of the agricultural lands as a mean of protecting wildland-urban interface in the macro scale. Here you have some examples of planning, typical fire breaks, fuel breaks, discontinuities, the road network to the improvement of the road network to ensure this ground accessibility, identify and transform the fuel transitions, particularly between these grasslands and shrublands and forested lands, and as well identify and design critical points which can open the fire and create a bigger spread of the fire, and for those identify which would be the transformation according to the existing traditional land uses, which entail much less fuel load, much less fuel continuity. I'm showing you the relationship between the critical points and the transitions, in which critical points actually they are reinforcing the transitions to avoid the growth of fire towards more spread fire in the crown fires. I mean, to avoid uncontrollable fires by treating these critical points. There are some examples here. You have a critical point in which we provide the transformation towards grassland with very low fuel load and very low continuity. Look, if the fire runs up the box canyons, can spread largely on catch the fires into the crowns of the pine woods and create a big disaster. So we have tried to transform those critical points, as I said before. And again, the importance of promoting and maintaining traditional uses of land, specifically livestock and agriculture, and create again these discontinuities by having these landscapes maintained and promoted. Now we go into the meso-scale, and to me that's the big challenge. Basically, because in the landscape we're talking about prevention planning for decades, but for the meso-scale, do not do that. We'll see. What I suggest to do is to transform the surroundings of the settlement and the internal part as well, so it is outside and inside the settlement, to reduce, basically first objective is to reduce fire activity, not to suppress, but to reduce to a level in which we can't fight the fire, which is inside our range of firefighting capability. Second is to provide an environment for safe and efficient firefighting and defense operation. That means that the fire level is such that in the worst case, we are operating, we are not burning ourselves, we are not exposed to fires or to smoke, or we are exposed to a certain level which is acceptable, let's say, to create this space in which we can fight safely and efficiently. Then to create the self-defensible space. That means that the firefighters do not need to worry about if fire is hitting the settlement, if there's a meso-scale in between this buffer area in which the fire activity will be dramatically being reduced, and they concentrate on their strategy in controlling the fire from the flanks or whatever. So create an opportunity sector, not a problem sector, for fire control. Then to increase safety and efficiency of eventual shelter-in-place operations, which they are more and more common to have these settlements within the forests, which are basically surrounded by fire. We have very few opportunities to perform a safe, efficient evacuation. So you are basically forced to shelter in place. So we need this environment to be transformed and to have this safe or almost safe and efficient environment in which we can shelter in place. Then to transform in the mid-term, taking into account that we have to rely on local administration and on homeowners. That's the idea. So let's have a look at some real cases and to fix some ideas about what that means, the transformation of the meso-scale. Here we have an example in Collserola, and that's typical in Mediterranean countries without all this settlement that has been developed without any thinking about the protection or safety against forest fires. That we see that we have a fuzzy border, which is not a clear border between, for example, a town or a city and the forest. It's fuzzy. We can easily draw a line involving all the houses. Sometimes it's really difficult. We have a high friction between the vegetation and the houses because they are mixed together, intermixed. So the friction between the vegetation and the house is really high. So basically we don't have any transition area in which give us an opportunity to have lower fire intensity and some opportunities for the firefighting and defense. Here you have some examples. We have the fire will reach the fire at full intensity. We have very few opportunities to protect the houses. On top of that, we have to think about the meso-scale, not only the outside of the settlement, but the continuity inside the settlement, and the role of the gardens and non-built lots have in the continuity and the load of the fuel and the spread of the fire inside the settlement. What that means is that the meso-scale also is considered inside the settlement, not only outside, but inside, as we will see afterwards. Let's have a very dramatic case in Collserola, particularly in this settlement, this community of the Collet de la Vinyasa. Collet de la Vinyasa, that's properly pronounced in Catalan. Here you have Collet de la Vinyasa is a place, and we have three different these three different consolidation vectors of the fires with this drawing of through the box canyons and ending on the top with a number of houses. So it is really dramatic to see that any of the directions would drive a fire towards the houses. Here's the situation. And in between we have several houses. The fire can find fuel everywhere. So for sure we can have some chrome fires running up to the top of the hill in which the friction between the vegetation and the houses is really high. This is the other scenario in which the fire comes from the other draw towards the shuttle, and this is reality. We're talking about fuel load, which are high fuel loads and high continuity, and the roads, they are not quite wide. The accessibility is quite limited as well. This is the real case. On the fuel load, as I say, is totally mixed with the houses. Another point, the same area is the El Col del Penitén on Las Planas, which is similar. We have this consolidation of tracks of the fire, with these box canyons, fuel continuity. Look, if you have a fire in the base, the minimum you can have some smoke going up and affecting the houses, but also the roads. See how exposed the roads are in this situation. Very few opportunities to really, really escape from this fire. This is kind of scary. That's scary. There's no meso-scale at all. There are no forest fuel control, limited amount of water, and limited accessibility. In that case, I mean, it is safe to operate in this situation? I think no, it is not safe. You're exposed to fire, you're exposed to smoke and fire embers. Here you have, from the other point of view, how it consolidates towards the houses with very few opportunities to really escape. So we have no actually we have no separation, no buffer, no transition area that give us a real opportunity to fire control and house defense and people defense. So we are directly exposed to that. So when the fire is coming here, this sector for firefighters is a problem sector. It is not an opportunity sector. It's very difficult to think about the big transformation here. To me, it is very unlikely that it could happen in this case, because the transformation should be of such an intensity, and that is, I don't know if it should be acceptable by the people and by the administration, but the fact is that we have this situation there. Here you have fuel load continuity mixed with houses, and no opportunities actually other than the roads. Difficult situation. So the question is, do we have a fire adapted meso-scale? Well, no. What we do is just to create, in the best of the cases, some fuel breaks surrounding settlements. But the fuel breaks will, what happens beyond the fuel breaks? Because we have the fuel breaks and give us an opportunity to more or less operate. But we have a very important phenomena, which is the firefighting paradox. The firefighting paradox means that when a fire approaches a settlement, due to the importance of the settlement, due to the importance that we have in the wildland-urban interface, we are more intensive firefighting there. So the fuel actually is not reduced. It is not reduced. So it is increased. That means that eventually the fire will reach that settlement out of capacity of extinction, out of capacity of firefighting, if we do not treat that fuel. So in the end, we are creating intense fire approaching the settlement, particularly approaching the surrounding firebreaks. That means that at the end, we are creating a rat trap. I mean, we think that we have safe because we have a fuel break, but actually at the other side, we did nothing. So we'll have a very highly intense fire and maybe a rat trap. I mean, we can be exposed to a big fire, or we can do actually nothing. So here we have the main criteria to create a meso-scale is to create an area in which we can operate to save the houses, to operate in the roads, to operate in the surrounding fire breaks, in the sense that in the worst case, we will not be affected at a level that the firefighting is not safe and not efficient. That's the main criteria to create this meso-scale. The second is, in case of the no firefighters, the firefighters cannot take care of that sector because we have a head which is a spreading or other critical flank which is entering a big spreading area. We have second criteria to create self-protective structures connected with microscale. That means that the fire hits the settlement, at least we have a low intensity fire approaching the houses that could be self-protective. So with these two criteria, we can map the meso-scale to understand which are the points in which the transformation of the vegetation, continuity and load are more needed and have to be more intense. To dimension to which extent we will create this transformation and in which intensity we should transform the vegetation. Here we have some examples of this is a typical surrounding vegetation in a settlement. This is beyond the fire break. We have no treatment, no forest management, and in case of a fire, we put all the forces there to stop the fire. So year after year, the forest fuel is accumulating, creating these loads of fuel of unbearable amount. On top of that, we have that beyond these fire breaks surrounding the settlements, we have accumulation of all the remains of treatments and garden cleanings and all these accumulations create eventually a very intense fire of running to the crowns and so. So when we design the fire breaks surrounding a settlement, we dimension that in the best case of fire, but normally we dimension that we do not take into account how will be the evolution of the vegetation at the other side of the fire break, creating these what I call rat traps. Besides, when we open a fuel break like this, we are creating a box in which we have a feedback of the air, and sometimes it is providing more intensity to the fire because of the high circulation of air. Look at this case, which is a real case in which, well, we have a fire break, but we cannot ensure that the fire will do not jump to the other side in which the fuel is exactly the same. This is at the left, we have inside the settlement, at the right, you have the open forest. So for sure, some fire embers or some big flames will touch the other side and continue spreading inside the settlement. What I mean is what we need further transformation of this, but taking into account other components like ecological, hydrological, landscape, and so, which are other values that the homeowners will ask for. What I mean is that transformation meso-scale has not to be ugly. It can be a nice transformation by designing a space in which the fuel loads at both sides are acceptable, giving us an acceptable level of fire to provide us an opportunity for firefighting. Here's what we say with this vortex created by the box of the fire break, creating or entailing a circulation of air. If we do not reduce the fuel, we'll have an increase of fire intensity. This is what we suggest to do instead of create a clear, sharp fire break, is to create a progressive transformation of vegetation on inclusion of prescribed burning on livestock. Here's, I'm sorry, jump to the end. Give me a minute, I will go back to the, sorry, up. Here we are. Let's try to open again this. Compartir pantalla. Here we are. Sorry, because these are some, I was telling you, some examples of this type of transformation. Instead of a fuel break, it's a transformation of surrounding vegetation. And it has not to be ugly. It can be a transformation that gives us vegetation structure which are acceptable in the sense of ecology and hydrology and so on. It has much less fuel load, as you can see in these cases. Other example is to use the existing agricultural lands. If they are treated, if they are maintained, they also contribute to this more safe meso-scale surrounding. May I stop a little bit about and talk a little bit about the importance of the houses in the border of the settlement? They are different. When we talk to the owners of the houses in the border, they say, well, why do you ask me to take these measures and do this, do that, and not the others? Well, because you are receiving the fire, you are in the border with the forest, you need to transform that. And you are contributing to the meso-scale. You are contributing to making this, to have the fire at an acceptable level and to perform this operation more safely and more efficiently. So the settlements surrounding the houses surrounding and the border of the settlement have an importance in the sense that they are the first front receiving the impact of the fire. So they have to be prepared in terms of forest fuel, water availability, accessibility, or protection infrastructure to protect the rest of the settlement. What we have in turn in Spain is just the opposite. Instead of treating those houses, those lots, those areas, what we have it's an increase of fuel load and not treatment. Why? Because we want to see the wilderness, we want to see the forest land, we want to enjoy the green. But the point that is the green and all that you have there is exposing our houses to the fire in case of the fire. Here you have what we calculated the exposure to the radiation of the houses and the opportunities that we have to protect those houses from the fire coming from the outside. You see that we have some more opportunities in the inside, but very little opportunities to those houses which are separate from the roads and particularly facing the slopes towards the forested lands. We have been checking those situations with a number of agents, firefighters, military, local and national administrations and defense bodies, and all they conclude that it's very difficult to move such amount of resources to such small places in which we have so many houses affected by fires very locally, that cannot be done. It has to be something different, something that has a degree of self-protection by reducing basically the fuel load in the surrounding of the house. Let's have a very close look what it looks like, what I'm talking about. This is the external part of the settlement, and you see the houses facing all these forested lands, while inside the settlements you have much less fuel load. What to do with this fuel load? Obviously, we need to treat that fuel load. But on top of this treatment of the fuel load outside the settlement, look at the friction between the first rank of houses and the forest. What we have is accumulation of fuel, green edges untreated, and we have emancipated garden species going into the forest. So we have a totally different transition area, a totally different ecotone in which the fire behavior is totally different. Here you have another example. There are remains on green edges, all connected to the forest. So we have exactly in the point we want to avoid the fire to growth. It's exactly the point in which we have the most intense fire. So we have very less opportunities to protect those houses in the border. We have an emancipated tree species coming from the garden, together with a very flashy fields like grasses, touching the green edges of very flammable species. So we have created a tremendous situation, just giving floor to the fire to affect the houses. And this represents very clearly what I want to talk about. We have this road, which is surrounding the more or less the settlements of the houses of the settlement. You have, at least we have a discontinuity and some accessibility to the houses inside the settlement. But we have these separated houses outside the road. They are in direct contact to the forest, which are very difficult to access from the other side. And on top of that, you have this phenomena of accumulation of fuel on the other side, in the side which is touching the forested land. So that means that these structures, these patterns, are very difficult to defend in case of a fire. Here you have again all these houses you can access more or less, but those separate houses are very difficult access. And on top of that, you are direct friction with the forested lands. So the houses of the border, together with the firebreaks, there are two elements that we have to treat first when we think about the meso-scale. We have to create those spaces to protect the houses. And that means that it's not only the commitment of the regional or local administration to create these fire breaks, but also of the owners to treat their own gardens, as we can see here in El Gasco, in Madrid area. Firefighters created this large 80 meters fire break, but ended in this, let's say, owner's garden with this wall. You can access that. So what happens is that, well, you are creating an opportunity here, but again, inside the settlement, you have a big problem because the fuel load is huge. So we have clear connection, a clear example of that. The micro scale, how it relates to the meso scale. I mean, to create a defensible space around the house means much more. Is to provide opportunity to the tactics and strategic of the firefighters in case of the fire effect in our settlement. Which is why in our plans we always identify which are the houses that should be treated individually to create a meso scale at the settlement scale. And that's the relationship between what one owner does has an implication to the others. How do we calculate the meso scale? Well, what we suggest to do is to look into first of all, the safety of the firefighters, protecting the houses or operating the roads or operating in the fuel breaks. Our criteria of safety basically is to not be exposed to heat amount that could entail harm or even worse, the killing of or entrapment of the firefighters. We have been doing experiments as well in the project Wuiwatch in terms of the efficiency of our equipment to protect from radiation, convection in this wildland-urban interface, distances and intensities. With that, we can create an algorithm that gives us an idea of which are the places within a settlement which are entailing more exposure to radiation and eventually to convection, but basically radiation, which is a direct relationship between the fuel load, the topography or the slope and aspect, and the wind conditions. So reading these maps means that treating the red points have much more effect in ensuring the safety of the firefighters operating in house defense operations than the yellow ones. That means that we need to treat not only the surroundings, but basically and mostly the inside vegetation of the settlement. That means that we have to think about the exterior, the surrounding fields, but as well the houses and the gardens. Why I say so? Because, for example, if we treat just the surroundings, we are and do not treat the vegetation inside, for example, the undeveloped lots or the gardens, we try to operate to defend the house. Still, we have some fuel load that can be activated, for example, by firebrands. The firebrands are disconnecting scales. I mean, a firebrand can be triggered by a large fire in the macro scale or in the meso-scale, but the effect is local. It's starting, setting a fire within the house and creating a problem surrounding the house. So the treatment of the surrounding of the houses, the treatment of the interior of the settlement than developed lots is as important or more than the vegetation surrounding the settlement. With this, you can see we try to protect these houses here, this house here. Even if we have a surrounding firebreak, it is not that easy. We have a lot of flammable fuel and load here to try to protect the house. That means that we are connecting the defensible space of the house to the meso-scale and creating a safe meso-scale by creating a multitude of single defensible spaces in a settlement. That's the main idea on the meso-scale inside the settlement. The same for the roads operation. This map gives me an idea which is the intensity of the treatments that I have to do in the vegetation to ensure that the exposure of the firefighters operating in the roads are acceptable. That means that I have to treat the vegetation as well to ensure that the operation in the roads is safe, including evacuation and operating from the roads, moving from one point to the other. As you see, this map is giving me an idea of a big transformation, not a small transformation or just the firebreaks surrounding the settlement. It's a big transformation outside and inside and surrounding the roads that I will consider for the evacuation operations. With this in mind, we can may think about the transformation of the surrounding forested lands, but also transformation of the gardens inside the settlement to, in case of we have a fire, the fuel load, like in this case, the fire intensity is much less, and it's acceptable to operate in these roads safely and efficiently. Some examples very quickly, because I'm extending quite a lot in the exposure of this presentation. This is the application of exactly the same concept I was talking about in the Les Planes in Collserola. And these are the treatment and the extension of the meso-scale to be treated to ensure that in case of a fire, in the worst case, we have the quite safe and efficient area in which to operate. We have an opportunity to defend the houses, and the same for the roads. This is for the roads. As you see, the importance of the vegetation not only outside, you can see here the outside surrounding the buffer which is created, but inside as well. So it's a transformation outside and inside to be an opportunity and not a problem. By summing, by overlaying one on top of the other, we have the final meso-scale to be treated, the extension and the intensity. It's more or less this, which is quite different to what we normally suggest to do, which is a firebreak surrounding the settlement. This is a total change of paradigm. We need to think about this very carefully. We need to design new ways of transforming this to make these transformations feasible socially, technically, economically, visually, and so, and try to design the settlements with this in mind. Finally, to end with this short presentation, some thoughts about the microscale. What happens around the house in Europe? Well, the houses are exposed not only to the fire front in case of the houses in the border, but also as well to fire embers. Fire embers for us are it's a problem in the term that they create spot fires, but they are not entailing always the ignition of the house. They may be related to the ignition of the house if the fire finds an opening and the fire embers enter the house. Then we have the sustained internal ignition and the destruction of the house. But as well, we have to think about the processes actually threatening the house and the important the flame contact. I mean, we have the flame touching the house, in our case, in the Mediterranean, particularly all the glasses, windows, and so. That means that the first important thing is the flame contact, we should think about the surrounding fields. And the surrounding fields are the garden, the green edges, which provide the nearest flame and heat source, but as well other different types of fields which entail the flame contact. On top of that, we have to think about to consider the house as a shelter. If we consider the house as a shelter, we have to think about endure not only the radiation and the convection, but also the endurance towards the smoke on the temperature inside the house to provide a safe place where to stay in case of the fire passing. That means we have to design and configure the house to serve as a shelter, and particularly to avoid the pass of the smoke on the fire embers. What we have observed in all these years is that a self-protected house has to do much with the good practices and good behavior of owners, particularly not having fields surrounding the house, on closing the windows, on closing the doors inside the house, and so. So that means that on top of the reduction of fuel load around the house, we have to do our best to increase the education and training of owners on good practices in case of a fire. As you see, this is a transformation which entails not only the garden, the physical part, but also the owners. And this can be done very effectively in the short term. In the next year, in the next summer, you can design and perform all these transformations in the short term. So this is the first thing I should do in case of doing something. Go to the micro scale and try to transform each of the houses, edges, and owners. That will be a very well invested time and money. Here you have a schema. What we are concerned about in the micro scale: the flame contact, the convection, accumulating heat behind the horizontal decks and terraces, the embers falling in places in we have accumulation of fuel, the same as United States, but the difference, and that we have to have some burnable materials of some entrances in which, through which the fire embers and the smoke can enter the house. We have the radiation, we have the smoke, but the important thing is that in our houses, we have some weak points like glasses, through which the fire could enter. So if we have the open window, or we have a opening due to the design of the houses, or the fire breaks the window, we have three different ways of giving path, giving way to the smoke, embers, and fire to enter the house and create a distraction. Or do not allow this house to serve as a shelter. Here you have some of the examples I told you in the micro scale, how it's the load surrounding the houses, the degree of fuel load due to the garden species, the degree of moisture due to the irrigation that is being given, on the degree of the flammability of the species, on the how close are to the houses, which is the design of the garden in terms of protecting the house and facilitating the fire spread or not. That means that the garden design, to me, is the most important part in the meso-scale transformation and adaptation, as well as we talked about the green edges, which are very close to the houses, entailing the fire to be very close to the fire, and eventually to have this destruction, or as well all the junk and all the fuels which are not vegetable, which are close or touching the house, entailing this flame conch that we were talking about. So as you see, there's much about the behavior of the owners than any other thing else. Breaking the windows and letting the smoke and the embers enter inside, and the role of the doors inside the house that we tested in the laboratory are giving us that we close the doors inside the house before we leave the house. We are dividing by 6 the chances of the fire embers smoke to enter the house. So that's as important. It's the behavior of the owners. Here we have some other experiments of the importance of the aperture between the door and the floor. All this small aperture, the importance of this distance between 5 to 10 centimeters gives more inflow of air and pulling the smoke and embers by 4 or 5 times more inside the house. So as you say, it's not only the physical part of the removal or the control of the garden, but as well the behavior. What we do actually is to design the gardens, the vegetation surrounding the house, to protect beforehand the house by making this wildland-urban interface index, which basically it's gathering the friction and the exposure to potential fire, and this triage that we do in advance help us to design the treatments as well, which is connected to the opportunities in the meso-scale. Here you have a non-existing microscale, non-existing meso-scale. Here you have a very good on the left and the right, very good microscale, which is providing a very nice opportunity in the meso-scale. So as you see, the skills are connected. I'm ending a little bit late, but I think that's a lot of interesting ideas here to draw. As you see, the skills are connected. Actually, yes. My suggestion is to start from planning and transforming from the microscale and create an internal meso-scale, as we saw. As you see, if we have a very well implemented macroscale, it increases in the end a settlement endures the pass of the fire and the embers. Even if you don't have a fire break in the border, at least you have this microscale prepared. So my suggestion, if you don't have money, you don't have time, you need to do something, start from microscale. That means transformation of the garden, endurance of the house, and most important, transformation of the understanding, awareness, and behavior of the owner. It's important to know about the relationship between the neighbors. What I do, or what my neighbor does, is affecting me and others surrounding him. So we need to understand the risk, not as individuals, but as a community, and to create this meso-scale. To prepare the meso-scale to provide an opportunity to firefighters for our protection entails to have a community understanding or have a common understanding of risk and a common understanding of the transformation. Because the fire embers and the smoke relate this, as I told you, the micro and meso-scale. They are not connected. The fire in the macro scale can affect the micro scale 2 or 3 kilometers away. So they are connected. Or even this case, and we have a small fire in the meso-scale, which is launching through in some embers in the smoke, is creating a microscale, it's creating a problem. So they are connected. They are connected. To end this presentation, some couple of slides talking about what that means in terms of the social reality. All this is very well understood by technicians. We have tools, we can identify, we can propose actions to transform all this in the macro, meso, and micro scale. But what happens in reality, that we have the social reality. We have administration, owners, interests, abandonment of lands, and so, and so, and so. So first thing, we have to understand why we are proposing those transformations. I told you the main criteria is to ensure the firefighters' safety. At least that. When we are talking to owners, please do something, at least to ensure the firefighters' safety. But it is not only one owner, but the whole community has to understand and have a common approach and understand which is the fire risk of the scales. We have to accept that transformation are required. We can't stand anymore that the fire is hitting a settlement at high intensity and we have no opportunities to do anything at all. And then the owners are asking for help and to save their houses and so without doing anything at all. So we have to transform and accept that transformations are required on vegetation infrastructure and more important in the people behavior. We have to accept that fire will be there, yes or yes. Fire will happen. We will try to minimize impact by providing some opportunities to firefighters who may succeed or not. We have to accept that firefighters may succeed or not. So we have to be, to some level, self-protected. The firefighters are not almighty. They may help us. If they have opportunities, much better. But we have to accept that firefighters might succeed or not. So to achieve that, we have to look at the transformation as an opportunity to create a better space. Better space is more beautiful and safer space. For that, what we are proposing is to create multifunction dialogue spaces, nice gardens, nice treatise areas, golf courses, to foster sustainability and feasibility, because the people may use those to maintain and foster those low continuity, low fuel loads, high accessibility, and high water availability meso-scales. That's what we're doing. We are proposing, more particularly in the areas surrounding the settlement, create those spaces in which can be used by the owners and to be maintained in a more natural way, and little by little in the long term to create these nice spaces, very nice landscapes that can be used, but at the same time giving an opportunity to firefighters to operate, more particularly in the meso-scale. I'm ending my presentation around 25 minutes delay with some conclusions. First of all, may I suggest to divide prevention planning in these three scales to help to understand processes. As you see, they are quite complex, and this division in three scales help us to approach that more in a systematic way, assess the activities to be performed, and give the assessment on the time scale, to assign the responsibilities, which is of the government, regional government, municipality, and owners, but also give us a very good start for planning and implementing at the micro scale. To me, it's the more interesting thing, is the micro scale. Working from now to the next day will create the meso-scale little by little, but in the short term. But we need to have a strategy in advance. Where to start, which are the points in which we have to treat more intensely, and include the local administrations and regional administrations in that strategical planning. Another conclusion, we may need from now on to create opportunities in the meso-scale. To me, it is a big challenge to extend the concept of the firebreak to something more, a larger buffer coming inside as well, created by all these microscales, and the meso-scale should include these dialogue spaces and include the understanding of this transformation from the community. And to me, this is the big challenge. We apply basically the safety and efficiency of the firefighters' operations criteria. And this is something that everybody understands. You want me to save your house, at least you have to provide me with a space which is basically safe and in which I can perform my operations efficiently. And that has to be the main criteria for designing and dimensioning the meso-scale. And finally, do not ever forget the social part, the human part, the human factor, to design dialogue spaces that can be used, thinking the human dimension of it, to include information and risk awareness campaigns. That's the keystone to succeed in the implementation of these plans. And of course, have this implication and the commitment of the owners in the whole process to create this defensible space. Well, I end here a presentation. I hope it has been of your interest, and I am open for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So, as you said, it's time for questions. We have, for the time being, we have at least one question from Luis Rivero. Luis Rivero said, so in Zoom, we should focus on people, correct? Inform, train, show them that their protection starts with their actions and behaviors. Either everyone helps or it's a lost battle. It's the only way to let firefighters fight the fire instead of constantly having to defend homes.
Yes, I totally agree with Luis. I think that is the starting point is the people. Without considering the people within the process of transformation, we do nothing. We do very little. I mean, in my experience, we go all the way around, starting by identifying the risks, identifying the possible actions. We have everything is planned, everything is in place. We go to the real world, to the ground, start the works, and we can do nothing because the people looks that like an aggression, like changing things that they have had for such a long time. So as Luis says, to me it's very important that we transform as well the coming generations. The existing generations are very difficult to re-educate. It's possible, but it's hard to re-educate, but not their kids. To me, the kids and young people are more open for a new awareness and new understanding of what's to live in the forest with, or not only forest fire, but other risks as well. To achieve that, I think that Marc Castanol told us very clearly, we need to dialogue and to get to an agreement, which is like a contract, the minimum. You have this like that, I'm able to do this, but not everything. And I think that the contact between the firefighters and society should be more, let's say, much easier. The flow must be much easier, more frequent. And on top of that, understand all of us together that the risk is a shared responsibility.
Okay, thank you, David. It seems that there are no more questions. I just wanted to highlight some of the topics that you pointed out during the presentation. You talk about the granularity and the different scales, the landscape, slope, the local scale, and the meso-scale and the micro-scale. And related what Luis said, the lack or the poor sense of community, and this lack of sense of community is a kind of paradox, because it's the more needed sense when you live in a wild urban interface and when you need to face this kind of problems such fires. And it's a paradox because most of the people that live there choose to live there just to escape from the city and to escape from a community, and choose to live there to try to get a kind of more feeling of individualism. So it's kind of a paradox, and for me, is the next challenge to fight this kind of lack of sense of community. So it seems that there are no more questions. I just wanted to, excuse me, there's a last question from Franco Casula. Franco, in the chat box, he said, I can find two main ways to improve safety at micro and meso scale. One is a framework of law rules. Another is the funding of the actions good practices. Can you see some other possibilities? Thank you. So, David, is your turn.
Well, that's true, Franco, that we should include transformation of legislation to provide us a regulation framework in which to support our activities. But in my experience, particularly in the countryside, it's a bit difficult to force people to do things. That can be done in the very dramatic cases that need to be done something. Okay, you do that. But in the other hand, I think it's much better to approach the people more like, well, if you do this, you are giving an enormous added value to your property and the community. To me, all type of social clubs, social associations, or leisure associations, leisure activities that implies a large number of members of the community, like, I don't know, any type of leisure activities, it's a very good picture to start thinking about, oh, well, let's think as a group, not at a number of individualities, and let's do it in a common way. Together to that, in my experience, Franco, the most important thing in this case, in our case, is to have a leader. Uh, whether it's the president of the community, whether it's the counselor of environment, whatever, but one person take leadership and be committed to change things. And this has been very effective in some cases in Spain, particularly in Madrid, and it should be like that. The problem is that this leader has to be followed by most of the people in the community. And today we have very, very heterogeneous population in a community, so it's very difficult. For example, I can tell you one example. Balearic Islands, we have very tremendous cases of wildland-urban interface. We have at least 3 types of people dwelling in the settlements. We have the locals, which are the less, we have the Spanish people living there, but understanding the Spanish way of living, and we have the retired Germans or Britons, which are living there, and they have a totally different approach to the thing. So we've tried to find a leader for them. Well, it's quite difficult because the foreigners, they have a leader, the Spanish, they have another leader, and the locals, normally they don't want any leader at all. They are the leaders of their own thing. So messages first to create these associations, clubs, or any kind of leisure activity that create this community. And second is try to find leaders to drive the whole thing forward.
Thank you, David. There's a huge and large question from Joao in the chat box. Joao said, from your perspective and considering that the decision makers, municipalities, political level doesn't have an accurate risk perception and this have direct link with the public safety policies and their implementation or lack of them, what strategies you would suggest to create awareness first to the decision makers and then the communities that they serve that can lead in the future to an effective emergency planning and preparedness? Many thanks.
Well, in my experience, I think that, as I told before, we need a leader. In my cases, and we've been doing some prevention planning, we've been very lucky to count with the councillor of environment of a municipality who is in direct and frequent contact with all the owners and dwellers and all the people there. So they have frequent contact, they take care of their problems, they transmit their worries, the owners, they transmit their worries, try to find solutions. But you are absolutely right, and more particularly when you talk about the regional and the national administrations. Well, to me, it is not the technical part, but it's the political part. The political part very rarely see in prevention a benefit for them. So my strategy is basically to create a community which is demanding prevention, and this demand entails requests to the politicians. That means that the politicians answers and provide a solution to this request, they will get some votes. In this case, the politics will see a clear benefit of his action. But to me, the important thing is that the population understands the risks, understand that they need some prevention measures, and ask for them and request them to the politicians. The problem is that we're, as I told many times, no fires is no news. No fires is no votes. When you have a fire, you have a reaction. It's something that everybody sees in the news. We have no fires. There's no way of measure the success of that prevention measures. So other strategies try to measure somehow and highlight the importance of the prevention measures in facing very dramatic weather situations or fire events. It's not easy, it's quite difficult, as you say.
Thank you, David. More questions from Marty. Marty said, yes, but leaders' communities have to be provided with information and resources to what and how the things have to be done. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. That's what I'm talking about, the flow of information and contact. I mean, the leader has not to be the president of a community or the people in the administration. It's a person that commits to the protection of the settlement, whoever he or she is. And I absolutely agree that she or he has to have all the information on the risk perception and a broad idea, broad view of the reality, the social and economical reality of the settlement, and so. Which is why, to me, it's very important that the leader is not only having access to that information, for example, by requesting to a consultant or to the administration, requesting that information, but also have skills, communication skills, social skills to communicate those findings to the people. But as you say, we have seen many times that when these leaders ask for information, the administration do not have that or do not have the will to provide that. And that should change as well. As I say, we have not a national or a regional regulatory or legislation framework to request all these, let's say, good practices from the politicians, I mean, those to finally take the decisions to behave such a way. So again, may suggest to create, as you said, as Jordi said, this sense, this community building first, the risk awareness, and they the request to the politicians to do something in such a way. It's not easy. It's not easy, but we work in such directions. Great questions, by the way.
Thank you, David. There's one more questions, maybe the last one. The question is from Ferran Dalmau from Medi21, which is a company. The question is, under the project experience, I assume Wuiwatch project, what do you think about the risk perception by the citizens and political managers? It's enough, insufficient, what are the challenges ahead? Thank you.
Oh, yes, Ferran, you know very well. You suffered yourself about this. The last fire we were together, I firsthand could see in the ground that people were behaving a very different way. Some of them were in panic, some others were just ignoring the fire, some others were curious about that. So the perception of risk is really heterogeneous, uneven. It depends so much on the type of people, how much time they spend there, how attached to the landscape they are, how many times they have seen the fire. So the perception of risk is totally different, very dramatically different from one person to the other. As I told, I think that the risk perception today is quite low in general. If I say so, is when you approach an owner with a prevention plan, they say, well, you are going to destroy my landscape, instead of, oh, thank you very much, you are going to increase the added value of my property. So the challenges are, first of all, to identify the different social sectors that we are talking about, which are our targets. In my view, the targets are basically the young people and the young owners. They are more open to transformations and to do things well. The other challenge is try to include some stakeholders that they have some agricultural land to provide the safety service instead of the production service of the agricultural lands or livestock. On top of that, in terms of technology, today we have these mobile phones, we have social networks, we have these emerging alternative reality games like Pokemon Go. They are very nice vectors to educate and provide some awareness. To me, I think the most powerful insight tool that we have to create this awareness are the almost immediate information that we get from the social networks like Twitter or Facebook of real fires. Real fires, they are very educating. I'm pretty sure that all the people that were in San Blas settlement, they have a total different approach to the forest fire. Now they have experienced firsthand the fire of the past June. So these are more or less my approaches, and I'm pretty happy to have opportunity to share with you some of these technological advances.
Thank you, David. There's a last highlight from Martí. Martí said, owners of the land scale and meso-scale forest owners are not the same as the owners of the micro-scale houses.
That's true. We could spend another 2 hours talking about the ownership and the prevention planning. Absolutely right. That's what I told you. We can't avoid the social dimension of it. I mean, social and administration dimension of it. We were actually lacking of specific law or regulation that provides any type of benefit to those ownerships that are, let's say, forced to transfer the lands for the protection of others. To me, that is unfair, because we don't have this regulatory figure of services for the protection. We have these services for the protection figure through which to the owners who are forced to do any kind of transformation to get some payback of any type, I don't know, some payback for those services, and what's more, to be accepted and appreciated by those who are protected. I mean, this is something that we don't have in place, and I fully understand that those owners are rejecting doing anything in their forests for nothing, just to protect others, because these others decided to live in near their forests. Absolutely agree.
Thank you, David. It seems that there are no more questions. So just before the ending of this webinar, I would like to announce that we will hold the final workshop of the Wuiwatch project in Barcelona next December 12 and 13. So please visit our webpage, wuiwatch.org, to have more information about this final workshop of the Wuiwatch project. So many thanks, David, for your presentation, and also, and of course, and especially, many thanks to all attendees to attend this webinar from Wuiwatch project. So thank you, and we'll see in the next webinar.
Thank you very much. It's been a big pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.